We are back with another installment of the Patriarchy broadcast, podcast, whichever way you want to slice it. I'm here with the esteemed Burger Meister, and tonight we're going to be talking about the, well, the ins and outs of the Chinese Revolution and the other, various revolutions that happened throughout that time period. So, hi,
Yeah.
Burger.
How are y'all doing tonight? This is a topic we've been wanting to touch on for some time now. We discussed it among our earliest episodes when we were talking about the American Revolution and so on, but we just had other things that came up and other topics that were more pertinent, especially with guests. So it's good to finally get around to this one. So, yeah, Chinese revolutions, plural. It's a quite a big topic, one that people aren't generally used to touching on. Um, you would figure somebody like us would do the Russian Revolution first, but it's been so overdone. So many people have covered that. And I'm just like, well, I feel like this one in some ways is actually more interesting. It's a little less clean cut. You've got factions on multiple sides that have their merits and demerits. So, yeah, this is something I've been looking forward to.
And well, I mean, there is the classic, communist versus nationalist sides, but that more so comes up later, after the Boxer Rebellion happened, because that was more so with the Boxer Rebellion. That was more just of a straight up, well, we don't like these foreign influences, um, so we need to really rely on ourselves and our own countrymen to build our nation, rather than those outside influences, which I thought was, well, in a way, they did carry the spirit of a lot of revolutions that happened before them, but not necessarily a clean cut carryover, as you said.
Yeah, the Boxer Rebellion, for one thing, was not inspired by any form or inspiration of Christianity the way that the Taiping Rebellion was. It was very much about native Chinese religion and culture. And originally, it was anti Qing in nature. They didn't like the Manchu dynasty. But then eventually, the Manchu dynasty got wise to the fact that they were in danger of being overthrown if they didn't attempt to deal with this in some way. So the Empress Dowager decided to work with the rebels against the Europeans in an effort to keep China relevant and not under European influence. However, as we saw during the Boxer Rebellion, that didn't work out too well for them. And then with the deposition of her and the fact that the child emperor really didn't have any effective regency after that, it pretty quickly led to the collapse of the empire in 1911, just 10 years later.
Well, and that precursor to all of that was, you touched on it, was the European influence of them basically coming in and, well, dismantling the culture, really, and dismantling what held the glue together throughout those empires, and the traditional culture that was throughout China. And with that came, well, I mean, what people could argue, what happened into Germany after World War I and the Weimar, or what happened in the split between East and West Rome. You have various instances in history where that culture loses itself to, well, do I want to say imperialization, or would it be more so that they lost their culture to, well, heavy drug use, the opium trade? But that's a sad state of affairs, because that's what's happening in America right now too, with all the fentanyl that's crossing the border, and people, dying, a lot of people dying from that. So you just have that degradation go on when people don't have any will to promote the culture, any will to live, sustain, you know, traditions or carry that out. So an empire, in many ways, can help keep the robustness of that nation going. So I found that to be very interesting that the opium trade and all that went on was very, very important to the precursor to a lot of this stuff happening.
Well, the opium trade, like opium addiction in itself, was only one part of how that trade eroded traditional Chinese concepts of society and particularly their interaction with foreigners, right? Like how they saw themselves when compared to um, the rest of the world. Because the opium trade was all about forcing China open, about bringing in commerce on European terms rather than Chinese terms. The Chinese, for centuries, had a very unequal relationship with the rest of the world in terms of how they interacted with them. Essentially, you either kowtowed, you showed submission to the son of heaven, the emperor in Beijing, or you were just a barbarian. There was no such thing as equal diplomacy for Chinese emperors, and a lot of what the Opium Wars did was just blow that entire narrative open, and you know, with nothing left to replace it with, the Chinese, their whole world essentially was starting to collapse. And another thing to note is that China had not been under native Han Chinese rule since 1644. The Manchu Qing dynasty that ruled them, you know, they could be viewed almost as a sort of successor to the Mongols in that way, because the Manchus were a very similar people culturally, but also because they used Mongols and other related peoples in their administration over the Chinese. You had a system of tiers where the Manchus were at the top, you had other steppe nomads like Mongols, intermediate, and then the native Han were kind of at the bottom. Um, so, yeah, it was very much a foreign system, and it only started to adapt to native Chinese ways during the 19th century, really. Um, even into the 19th century, Han Chinese were banned from entering Manchuria, and there was an actual wall erected to keep them out that became less effective over time. As we can see today, the Manchu people are almost extinct, and Manchuria is mostly populated by Han Chinese, um, much in the same way as Tibet is becoming today. But yeah, um, it was already a foreign empire, but now they at least embraced the parts of the Chinese imperial tradition that benefited them, like the concept of the Son of Heaven and a lot of the Confucian religious elements. Um, but you know, when the Europeans came, that was so foreign. It was such a dismantling of their entire system. Christianity was so foreign to them, especially the highly evangelical Protestant type that began to spread there during the 19th century, that it combined with native Chinese traditions to produce things like uh, whatever you want to call the faith of the Taiping Rebellion. Guy comes up, literally says he's the brother of Jesus Christ, and he's going to overthrow the foreign Manchus. Um, just crazy stuff that goes on.
I mean, far be it from me to make a bold statement like that, but they sure do like to make their bold societal statements now, don't they? I mean, I thought it was really interesting that throughout the foreign influences as to how, well, I mean, essentially culturally, traditionally, and really all throughout on how ethnocentric they really are. Um, but I had no idea that the Manchus or you know Mongols or closely related to the steppe people, which in essence kind of gives it like a ethnic caste system in a way, caste system, and it gives to various degrees um a lot. It makes a lot of sense on the European side, or should have made a lot of sense on the European side, because well, Europeans have had their racial or ethnic, I should say, caste systems too. Obviously, ours was more, deemed in royalty to peasantry. Um, but the unrelenting nature of just how they've dealt with things and how their culture has kind of sustained throughout all of that too is just mind-boggling, because you think out of all of that, well, death, decay, and just absolute, destruction of what their culture once was, and how much they've brought to the world, really, and how much they've innovated, you think their culture would just be be kind of dampened and dead, but it's so strong. It still lives through a lot.
Well, and in the case of China, one thing that makes that true is the fact that they've been under like foreign rule many different times, much more than modern examples of them would like to admit. Um, as previously mentioned, the Mongols, they had conquered all of China and, in fact, united it from when it was split into multiple different dynasties. Um, the Jin dynasty, which the Mongols conquered in northern China, were themselves Jurchens, so they were predecessors of the Manchus in many ways. In fact, the Manchus early on called themselves later Jin. But yeah, like northern China in particular has been conquered many times by different foreign dynasties that always enthrone themselves in a Chinese style. The Mongols were the closest thing to a truly foreign rule, but even they became Sinicized over time out of necessity. But talking about the whole like Manchu and with the European comparison to that system, a lot of Europeans actually saw the Manchus as inferior to the native Chinese because they saw them as being like the Mongols, like this barbarian horde that came in and occupied, whereas the native Chinese did have a very ancient culture going back thousands of years. So, whether that was done purely as a form of propaganda against the Qing to, make waging war on them easier, or if it was a genuine perspective, I'm not too sure about. But either way, there were definitely differences of opinion from all sides on the matter.
Which kind of makes it all the more easier to, well, I guess ethnically cleanse, or be more comfortable with getting rid of, and not having to deal with the people who they don't deem to see fit, which kind of goes into the communist aspects and the communist mentality of a lot of this, where that mentality just carries over into them not having a problem, well, wasting human life, um, and not having, well, a state religion or any kind of transcendent values. I mean, when you go through, well, not only physical and violent warring revolutions to civil wars like they have, and then you tie it into a mentality of just life is just worthless, and not having those, so strong cultural traditions to back it up. Well, that then there's a lot of recipes for disaster and making the power struggle seem even all the more poignant because of the fact that you had that push and pull between the nationalists and the communists for a very long time. That kind of that does foreshadow into all the dynasties and empires rising and falling and then being at odds with each other just based on ethnicity. Now, however, they had the traditions to back a lot of that stuff up. But with communism, it was just kind of a barren belief, right? There's nothing to really back that up besides the state. So that kind of, that makes it, I don't want to say depressing, but it makes it a bit more, or a bit less, well, what's the word I'm looking for?
A bit more barren, perhaps.
Yeah, it's just nihilism, really. I mean, it's just political nihilism just on steroids with just piles and piles of bodies, unfortunately. And it does remind me a lot of, what happened with the Soviets, right? And especially, the Holodomor and everything that happened with that. The Ukraine wanted to rise up and wanted to revolt, but they obviously couldn't against Soviet Russia because of, I mean, it was just a barren ideology that was going against, well, what I can relate to and what you can relate to more so, Orthodox Christians, and them just basically dismantled from every which angle, especially the main one being they were so starved to death that they couldn't do anything about it. So it just really compounds itself into that.
Yeah. And it's very easy to jump to the communist revolution, especially when it's the most culturally relevant one for us today. But where we should do is kind of cover this in a bit more of a chronological order and talk about the Xinhai Revolution of 1911, which is when the last dynasty of China, the Qing Empire, got overthrown and replaced, in theory at least, by the Republic of China, which was under the Kuomintang, the same people who fled to Taiwan in 1949. Um, Now, that revolution was Republican in nature, um, at least at first, and it promoted a sort of liberal nationalism in China, um, of a type that was very influenced by 19th century European concepts, like the German and Hungarian revolutions of 1848, for instance. This was led mostly by Western educated Chinese, like Sun Yat sen, who was the main initial leader of the revolution, um, and sort of saw it was a combination of Western liberal ideals along with native Chinese nationalism against Manchu and European occupation in equal measure. Though its main target was the Manchus because they saw them as the ultimate problem and the reason China was weak enough to get in this situation in the first place. Um, so yeah, like we'd said, the Boxer Rebellion had critically weakened the Qing dynasty, which had been in decline for over a century by this point. And finally, in 1911, this great revolution broke out. And while I don't know too much about the exact details of how and when this sparked and exactly why in the short term, I do know that in the long term, it was a long time coming. And so there was a brief civil war, the Qing were overthrown, and now the Kuomintang had a very loose hold on the central government. But the thing about this is that the main forces backing them were the Beiyang armies, which were the late Qing westernized European style armies that had been built by various generals who now were effectively warlords over their own regions. So, in something you could say is similar to the Byzantine thematic system after the whole collapse of their eastern frontier in the wake of the Muslim invasion, well, the Qing sort of appointed these generals who were simultaneously effectively governors of their area. Um, and once the central imperial government collapsed, different ones that had different loyalties all sort of assumed their own power. There were some of them that were monarchist, and one of them, Yuan Shikai, in 1916, actually proclaimed himself emperor. There was an extremely short lived Han imperial dynasty, technically, under him that regained power, but it very quickly collapsed afterwards during World War One. So, um, but anyway, the Kuomintang held a sort of loose central power, mostly headquartered to the south in Nanjing, um, from 1911 up until World War II. And World War II in Asia begins in 1937. Um, or really, you could even say 1931 when Japan occupies Manchuria. Um, but the open warfare in China starts in 37 with the Marco Polo Bridge incident in Beijing. But, up until then, there's just warlordism and just fighting between various warlords, the nationalist government, and then the early risings of communism. Mao Zedong, before the Long March North, was initially based in southern China and was fighting the nationalists there. Um, but then this goes into World War II. Um, all the Chinese sort of form a united front just to fight Japan um, for the duration of the war once they realize how bad things have gotten. And then at the end of the war, we actually come to the civil war between the nationalists and the communists. So this is when we actually get to the communist topic. But if you want to talk about anything before that, then
It's really easy for somebody to, proclaim themselves king or emperor, which I always, no matter what historical topic and or in and out, I always get a laugh out of it because of how easy it is. Because you're like, well, I don't have anybody to compete with, so yeah, guess I'm head honcho now. What do you think, guys? Well, you disagree with me? I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. It's always it's funny. Um, but then there you said about the warlords too, which was really interesting to me because that to me kind of seems like on how they came up with provinces and how they came up with provinces, and categorically um having provinces to each ethnicity in China. And obviously, with the two different main dialects in China, you know, I know those are based off two different ethnic Asian groups in China. So, when you got the influences of the different dialects with the different ethnicities, that's really, really cool. And it's like you can see on how they were in a sense westernized with that because you know different nations have different provinces, states, counties, city states, what have you, really. um but then they kind of westernized themselves under different warlordships. So that's kind of, I thought that was kind of neat. And yeah, that long march, whew, man. I mean, I know they were communists, but that's straight up willpower and inspirational. I mean, no matter what way you cut it, it's just pure. That's just pure will and force of will by the communists. So that was kind of amazing to me when I heard about that.
yeah, um, yeah, it is interesting when you look at every faction has its merits and its downfalls in this scenario, right? It's a much more morally gray revolution, at least at first. than other ones that are often covered, at least from from a traditionalist Christian perspective. Um, but the nationalists, in many cases, had a lot of Christians in their ranks, actually, particularly Catholic and Protestant ones. Um, it was it was an anti-foreign movement that was very foreign influenced, actually, and that made it kind of unique. It was sort of adapting to the ideas of the West in a kind of similar vein to how Japan did with the Meiji Restoration. Um, but at the same time wanting to preserve Chinese independence and power. But it failed in doing so just because all these warlords that had the real power were so disparate in their views. It was so motivated by individual concerns. And talking about how easy it was for somebody to proclaim himself emperor, that's just the mandate of heaven. The traditional Chinese idea of imperial legitimacy was never as rooted as Western dynasticism. It could be very flexible depending on who was winning at that moment. So, effectively, if you were coming out on top in a succession dispute or a war to claim the mandate for yourself, you were seen as having the support of the gods and of the natural order. Effectively, it's sort of an elaborate way of saying might makes right, except with additional things like natural disasters. The Mongols fell largely because they had a ton of natural disasters occur under their reign that caused mass starvation in China. And then the Chinese people said, well, they've clearly lost the mandate of heaven. And that, along with the governmental problems of the Mongols, led to the revolution of the Ming Dynasty in the 1300s. But yeah, so China inherently has sort of a built-in instability to it. With that also functions to help legitimize a usurping dynasty after they take power. And so this has been applied not just to dynastic governments, but even to the Republican and communist regimes. Everybody has tried to claim it in some form or another. And even in modern Chinese communism, you can see elements of the ancient philosophy of legalism that was employed under China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, and the Qin dynasty. Um, and a lot of people have argued that Chinese communism has sort of morphed into a neo legalism in a lot of ways, of just pure statism without any real ideology backing it.
Well, I mean that that will to power, that might makes right, if the gods deem it so. I mean, you're right. It isn't well d- dynastic as the West like proclaims it, because you always have that air of mystery, that air of influence, or I mean, just absolute debauchery, depending on the monarchy, depending on the monarch too. Um, and obviously, throughout the ages in the West, it's got its fair share of bad ones. Um, but like you said, there's no morally clear cut area. It's there's a lot of gray, which I mean, you could definitely argue in the West that it's the case with it as well. But the just the way they think about things, and they more so philosophize about things, does make it, I guess, more on a, I don't want to say completely like puritanical basis, but it's like for this, just how the sake of something exists just because it exists. Like there's not a whole ton of, and I think this is what helps spur an ideology, is there's a religious either replacement for it or some kind of religious context to it. Like it creates that fervor. With what I found with these revolutions, that there was a certain influence of that to it, but it wasn't as obviously pronounced. Like they weren't doing things in the name of God, in the name of the emperor, in the name of this. They were just doing it because, well, frankly, for survival, or, they thought, oh, those ideas were better than that guy's ideas. So, oh, yeah, well, we can just do away with that other side, and no big deal there. We just like what he says. And if he appointed himself as emperor, well, then we're just going to go with him, right? So it goes back to that. Well, I'm the big guy, so you guys got to listen to me now. It's kind of a music. Well, it's a Chinese fire drill in a lot of ways. So it's kind of ridiculous too. But that to me just shows like on how something like that ideology doesn't really matter much. It's just a barren statism that it just doesn't matter any way you slice it. It's always going to be morally gray. Like there's no black and white with this, which I thought was very, it's really kind of mind boggling to me.
Yeah, for sure. It's a very hard mentality to really get into and understand from our perspective of Western, frankly, Abrahamic religious background, where religion in a traditional society takes center stage and everything is made informed, it is informed by that. So, yeah, to see a society where religion in large part is shaped by society rather than the other way around, um, it and not in the modern sense either. It's so different and so fundamentally foreign, both in China and in Japan too. Just East Asia in general, its religious culture is so different from the West because these people, they at least traditionally they're very superstitious and religious in one way, but then on the other hand, uh, their religion doesn't have as much actual influence, right? Like they don't even treat it as much as a religion as or as much as just a worldview. Um, it's less a god or even gods that are worshipped, and more just nature and the concepts of natural order. And whenever these things are seen as being violated or they are seen as being angered, well, then, clearly this person has lost the favor of the gods and of the heavens. There's no. There's no real defining text. There's no real defining, and this is where sort of religious philosophies like Confucianism come in, because uh, Confucius and Lao Tzu and other philosophers provided a sort of quasi religious framework that society was based off of for centuries. Um, and Confucianism, when combined with legalism, sort of led to this extremely literate, extremely bureaucratic culture in China, where sort of everything is based around magistrates and around scholarship and learning. So, imperial exams were a thing for many centuries, and they were based primarily off Confucian values. Um, and it led to sort of this denigration of the warrior class. You don't have a warrior aristocracy in China to speak of, at least not outside of a very limited context. Arguably, the warlord period after the fall of the Qing dynasty was the closest thing that China ever truly had to that. Um, but it's kind of this dichotomic, weird situation where the warriors are never glorified in that society. In modern China, it's very unprestigious to serve in the army, for one thing. There's a saying that why use the finest steel on nails, essentially, that is directed at that. They believe that scholarship, learning, and be it in traditional Confucian values or in the tenets of the Communist Party, nowadays um, are better signs of a higher individual rather than just like valor, for instance. Whereas in the West, the aristocracy was always rooted in martial values, even if it became less so over time. Um, but this has led to China being easier to conquer than you would think um, by various foreign dynasties and the like over the centuries. The only reason people like the Mongols or the Manchus were able to take over such a massive country with such an enormous population disparity is because they didn't really have a very strong native martial tradition. I mean, sure, there's things like native martial arts, but a lot of those developed in secret. Um, Secret societies are a big thing in Chinese history. And a lot of the rebellions, especially the revolutions against the Mongols and against the Qing, were created by secret societies. And a lot of the martial arts we see were sort of developed under, especially in the case of the Mongols, a lot of these secret societies as ways to resist with a lack of weaponry, you know? So it is interesting with that lack of a warrior aristocracy, but at the same time, you always come into uh, kind of might makes right at the same time situation with the mandate of heaven, and it's just very contradictory seemingly, um, and it's odd for sure.
Well, it is odd, and with the traditions of, like you said, the superstition and the superstition not only tied around the dynastic influences of how the rationalization of Confucianism, which is basically in a sense Asian rationalization, and he is I mean, in a lot of ways he was Nietzsche, he was a Caesar, he was various Socrates, Plato. Like you can compare Confucius to a lot of people across the board in as far as Western influences go, as their writings, and to how they carried out the various bureaucracy and aristocracy and all that. But there was never a unified force. There was never a unified force making it a clear cut example to follow. Because of the obvious lack of religion, or having a lack of a centralized state too, which didn't come in until later, obviously with communism. But the interesting part is that rich tradition, the rich martial arts that are throughout, basically all of East Asia. People will think that one guy like Bruce Lee could just take down an entire army, right? Because of how strong he was, and you kind of see those as mythical characters, and to compare it to the Greek or Roman gods in a way, you could. But what's interesting is that on how you touched on how the martial arts were used as secret societal standpoints and cultural standpoints, and also very strong and ethnically proud of how they are throughout Asia about the martial arts. I mean, you have in Japan, you have karate, where they're very stern on karate's the only way. In Korea, it's taekwondo, and then obviously the big one, and we all know what China is famous for, good old fashioned kung fu, is that you had the various elements throughout that, and you even had religious influences when it came to the martial arts. You have the Shaolin monks and how religiously traditional they are through their beliefs through Buddhism, and then how they can apply, Confucianist philosophies to even what they believe, their superstitions, their their meditations, their practice, and how they carry themselves throughout, the influence of the martial arts. So it's really interesting to me on how it never formalized and how that moral grayness never really carried over into something as well, what would be considered mar- martial martial arts as those, right? Because of on how militaristic Christendom did get for the sake of the West, right? To save it from the Crusades, or from marauders and from hordes of Muslims in the Crusades, as to that didn't really happen in China, which always kind of shocks me because of how militaristic it could have gotten, especially in somewhere like China. And it's how big of a population it was, and to how rich in tradition it was, both in culture and especially in something like a martial arts tradition that it had, and it could have infused itself. And I want to get all Warhammer 40K on this, but it could have literally infused itself into a type of warrior dynastic emperor culture to say that they were fighting for the emperor, right? So they could have literally carried itself out, but there was never that clear cut string of it. You always had marauders and people defending themselves all throughout Chinese history. There was never that clear cut unification. It just never made sense, and this is probably making sense as to why the rest of it is kind of like the past reflecting on, well, the past, I guess, since what we're talking about all happened in the past. But now it kind of brings it to the forefront of the future too, and the present, as well as what's going on, and reflecting on China now, as you said, with that steel and nail anecdote slash proverb, which is really really interesting, because as strong of a culture as they are, you think that militaristically they would be, you know, kind of proud of it, and a little bit more of the strong arm nation, right? Than all the other Asian nations. So that just kind of shocks me.
Yeah. Talking about the like martial dedication to God or the emperor, or in a lot of cases, that reminds me of Japan. Actually, you could say that Japan sort of deployed those ideas and those martial traditions in a way that was much more centered on the idea of the emperor as a person, right? Whereas in China, it was much more about the imperial system, um, much more impersonal, you could say. And so this led to there not being this fanatical devotion, especially because there was, like I said, no real warrior aristocracy. You didn't have samurai to speak. Oh, I'll be right back.
You didn't have any samurai. You didn't have any Bushido code. You didn't have any of those characteristic influences. And as you said, it was more of a systemic, um, and or like like a calling down from the top kind of mentality. It really didn't have a mentality as to where it was centered around one person. Like, I'm doing this for the emperor, like hail the emperor, which kind of makes sense because of on how they didn't have they had more of a dynastic and systemic kind of approach, or systematic kind of approach, rather than a centered around one person. And obviously to us, and that's kind of foreign as Christians, because of on how we centered around God, centered around Christ, right? So them not having that centered around that one person, right, makes it strange and it's not as clear cut or as defined as what it could be in the West, and that definitely makes it morally gray. That doesn't make it as clear cut as it possibly could be, but it also leads to the dynasties being, well, also morally gray, and also very very interesting in and throughout history and how it worked, um, and makes it, a lot tougher to tackle.
Yeah. Um, but anyway, this can be kind of a big rabbit hole, um, which is why I kind of want to move on to the communist part of this, which the communist revolution is, communism, like liberalism and other Western philosophies, entered China in the wake of the Boxer Rebellion and the Xinhai Revolution. And, it was also led by largely Western educated Chinese at first. Um, and like I said, World War II happened. The Chinese largely fought together against the Japanese. And then towards the end of the war, the Soviet Union entered the war in 1945 against Japan. And they stormed over Manchuria and northern Korea in very quick order, as the Japanese Empire was collapsing. And this sort of caused the final collapse of Japanese ground forces, which had mostly held out in China until this point. And, with massive Soviet involvement, you've got the largest army on planet Earth with all of its equipment having just finished defeating Nazi Germany that has now rolled into Manchuria and northern China. Um, all this support immediately goes to the Chinese communists, um, and especially through areas like Xinjiang and like Puppet Mongolia, which were also communist controlled. So um, this gave the communists, who were formerly the weaker faction in China, a huge boon of support that the Western powers, through their war exhaustion and lack of will to continue martial operations, just were not willing to back up. The only power that had any real will in the matter was the US, and they were, busy enough with Japan and with Southern Korea. So this led to just massive, unbridled Soviet involvement and support for the communists during the Civil War, which reignited after the end of World War II. And so the communists won. They managed to push the nationalists over the course of the next 4 years out of mainland China. And finally, in 1949, the nationalist government fled to Taiwan, where they were then protected by the United States. And this is when communist China really begins. Um, that date of 1949 is when they sort of celebrate their revolution to this day. Um, and so here is when Mao starts to really enter the picture and begin doing things in the 50s with the Great Leap Forward, which truly was just a repeat of Stalin in so many words. I mean, you take Stalin and you put him in a situation with Chinese levels of population and numbers, and the results are just horrible. Like the amount of death that occurred, the amount of things that were thought to be bad that were purged that then end up being necessary to produce crops. Like when they got rid of, I forget what bird it was, but Mao launched this huge campaign against this particular type of bird that was thought to eat crops. When in reality, the bird was eating the pests and insects that were themselves eating the crops. So you just had starvation on an untold level at this time, you know, and just the fact that they were able to get through that and that it went relatively unnoticed in the West until much later. Um, it's almost surreal, because it gets so overshadowed by the atrocities that happened during World War II. Um, when this was inarguably, in terms of sheer human numbers, much greater.
Well, you do have a sense of that weird plug and play and how it, and how it did overshadow. And how World War II overshadowed, obviously, into this. And you didn't, you touched on the fact that the Russian or the Soviets came in and helped out to really turn the tide. And we could, go back and forth on conspiracy theories with that. But really getting down to the brass tacks of it, it was just military force and being backed up to kick out the nationalists, to get rid of them because of what they stood for. And the problem with that is that they weren't, um, the clear cut good guys either. But they obviously wanted to, in a lot of ways, keep the traditional values of China, but they also wanted to bring in the the Western liberalism, the Western ways of dealing with government and dealing with things that were that could have been westernized in the East. So there was a definite influence with that. And then you had the Great Leap Forward and the youth that was used to well create a soft coup too, just kind of like Stalin used in the Ukraine, especially. He used the youth there to call people out. Oh, these people are eating this, these people are doing that, and just to report people to the police. And got really out of control under Mao and Stalin, obviously, and those atrocities, like you said, are frankly covered up and weren't uncovered until much later because of the overshadowing of what happened during World War II, which is always, pushed aside because of obviously atrocity after atrocity is just, by that point, it's just so mind boggling that people are even capable of this on such an untold scale. But, Mao in a lot of ways, I don't want to say he was underhanded about his intentions because unlike Stalin, he kind of wore this as a badge of honor rather than Stalin, who, swept the stuff under the rug and just, had the audacity to say, oh, no, I don't believe it. Oh, no, I don't believe it. Whereas Mao was proud of it and he carried it and was like, well, if you're not going to buck up to the system, well, we don't need you anymore. We'll just find somebody else to replace you, kind of mentality. So it was really a tale of, the same ideology, but very two different leaders who were, I don't want to say Mao came from a peasant family. Stalin came from a well-to-do Catholic family. So that's the weird part. You had those two different mentalities where, it's really strange on how those personalities with the same form of government really, really, step. Uh, I don't want to say step away from the problem, or well, cascade their dark shadow over it in different ways. That's kind of more what I wanted to say.
Yeah, for sure. You could say that Mao is really a bit more akin to Lenin than to Stalin, um, because he did seem to be a true believer in communism, um, which a lot of people say that Stalin was too. And that was just his manifestation of it. Um, but yeah, Mao was very ideological for sure, but also very practical in his application of it, at least towards the end of his rule, right? Like the idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics comes about um, during the Cultural Revolution, which occurs later in the 70s, um, towards the end of Mao's rule. And the Cultural Revolution itself was largely a response to the failures of the Great Leap Forward. Um, because the Great Leap Forward, you know, in the end, it did end up resolving a lot of China's famine issues, but only because so many people had died, they just had less mouths to feed. I mean, that's so gruesome, but at the same time, like, yes, I mean, you did end up having a China that could feed itself, but at what cost, you know? Um, the Cultural Revolution was much more, as the name implies, cultural in nature. It was much more about re educating and really getting the population as a whole to actually believe in communism. And this is where a lot of the turning youth against their elders and things like that really came about, was during this time. The emphasis was very heavily on waging class warfare against the previous educated class, and purging of non-communist intellectuals. Um, and this was a much more, I guess you could say, pervasive thing than the Great Leap Forward, which was much more about material concerns. Um, this was, this was where the Communist Party didn't just want people's loyalty; it wanted their devotion. And Mao was doing everything he could to really push that in society. And the fact that communism has lasted this long in China is largely because of this, because of that basic fundamental belief in communist ideas, even if they become diluted over time. Um, this is the only reason that the CCP, regardless of the individual leadership, has a very strong hold on China at the moment. Um, and it's not as unstable as people would like to think, given that it's a communist government. Um, but yeah, um, this the purges that occurred during the Cultural Revolution just added to Mao's kill count, of course, but they were much more significant in terms of the mentality of China's population and of the purging of traditional Chinese culture in the name of this new communist state that would later adapt through, the efforts of Deng Xiaoping and later Chinese leaders. It became less about socialism and more about the Chinese characteristics of it. But the socialism yet still remained. And so I would say that China is probably the most stable communist regime to ever exist, largely for this reason, because of the totality of how they implemented things.
Well, and obviously, I mean, this relates to what's going on now with, well, modern American politics. I mean, I'll interject it where I can, I guess, to a degree. I don't want to overstate it, and I don't want to overblow it, because it can get annoying to a lot of degrees. But that ideological possession is really the ramifications as to the system of in out with the old, in with the new kind of mentality. No matter how those intellectuals thought, how they went about solving problems, right? That, mistake that was made in the Great Leap Forward, no matter how, well, outright, in a lot of ways, overtly charismatic Mao was, in promoting it, but with all the blood on his hands, how could he get out of it, right? And not be blamed for any of it, because if you blamed them, it was in a lot of ways a very Western mentality, off with your head, right? So it has all these influences and all these overlaps as to how they went about things. But the mind, I mean, it's just constantly mind-boggling at how just like lackadaisical it all is. And how, well, we lost a few million over here, no big deal. These ones will replace it. Well, less mouths to feed, no big deal. That one, they'll replace it. It was just it's basically just a plug and play. No wonder why it did sustain itself, because of not only staying power, but I mean just the pure ideological possession that people were under, and just the emphatic belief in the system that does now overstates itself in American politics, right? And it's not necessarily uniquely American either, because this is there's nothing new that's under the sun, obviously, but it's just different shades of a morally, well, bankrupt system now because of how it has transpired. And it all decays without a belief in God anyway. But that's a more of a morally concise statement. Now if you go back and really dissect on how the differences between the West and I'm not talking about Western and Eastern Christianity now. I'm talking about like the East and the West, like literally, Asians and Europeans, and how they break down these systems as to how this ideological possession can take over a culture where it hasn't so much in America because of how, well, and how Christendom has been a bulwark against the complete overtaking of it. Um, and that gets to the point where it leads, and it just creates this massive tidal wave and backlash of culture on having these quote unquote, well, I guess you could say many revolutions after the Boxer Rebellion, after, like you mentioned, the Taiping Rebellion, and after that the Communist Revolution, right? To where these many ideologically possessed revolutions happened, and then, well, it's either going to be successful or quashed out, by the big bad government. So I mean, it's mind boggling because of how morally gray it all really is, because human life is just expendable by that point.
Yeah, for sure. Um, and and another thing that led to the longevity of the communist regime was not just how total it was ideologically, but the fact that it was flexible, that it recognized that the economics of communism were in many ways unsustainable, um, at least as they were implemented in a Marxist Leninist context. Um, and so, you know, the idea became a much more moderate form of socialist economics, once again with Chinese characteristics, um, that dominated after, Chairman Deng. And, I find one of the most interesting perspectives to look at this from is to look at it from the official Chinese state perspective in the time of Chairman Xi, because, you know, Xi Jinping thought is a new school that is being pushed now as being the personal ideology of their current glorious leader Winnie the Pooh. He's got his own school of Chinese communism that he is now trying to make the official way that communism in China functions, which it kind of is now, but he's trying to maintain that, right? And the way he frames Mao is interesting because he frames Mao as being a great but misguided leader, right? He basically says that Chairman Mao led the revolution, but he made a lot of mistakes. And now, Deng and Hu Jintao and other leaders between Deng and Xi were all just sort of leading China to this point um, to where now with Xi Jinping's thought, it's sort of that he's completing the revolution, if that makes sense. The idea that sort of everything was just leading up to this, which of course is convenient to say when you're Xi because it makes you seem like the legitimate leader of the Communist Party when he's got competition, right? Jiang Zemin, who was the leader before him, is still at large in China. He still commands the second most support after Xi. And so a lot of what Xi is trying to do is basically say that his ideology and his thought makes his predecessors obsolete. Not tarnishing his legacy or anything, but just saying, hey, what I'm doing is the natural conclusion of all this. Therefore, all you should just go with what I'm doing. Um, so it is interesting how these different leaders in China are justifying their actions via one another, and how they portray the backdrop of communism with regards to this. And they almost never say communism either, right? They always say socialism with Chinese characteristics. That is Chinese communism at its core, and that is what they have really believed in more than anything ever since Deng, at least. So it's just interesting how that is developed, and it's a very flexible, malleable ideology depending on who's using it and who's in power.
Well, they certainly I mean, the Asians seem way more systematic and systemic with it, which is probably why it survived for so long and is probably as like an ideology, it's been carried. And in a sense, too, it's dynastic in a way. They have that dynastic mentality with it because of how, and how it has been carried and how the characteristics have adapted and how they've adapted to it to make it fit and to make it, you know, well, like I said, a plug and play mentality and it suits their ideological needs. So that makes, a lot more sense now.
Yeah, um, for sure. I think that their inherent societal stability does have a lot to do with this. The fact that their history goes back so much further than most of the world, and that the idea of social stability and order is very important too to them, right? Like the worst thing that can happen under a dynasty is for chaos and destruction within China. So it follows that whatever maintains that order, maintains the status quo the best, is generally considered the best option. And so Chinese communism is very much adapted to this and adapted to sort of the slow growth mentality. Um, at least, at least it seems that way, right? Because they have done a lot of very fast, rapid growth as a facade. Like they build these massive cities on the coast that look amazing and modern to us in the West, whereas deep inside the country, outside of our view, it's very different. They're sort of trying to regain that prestige of the Middle Kingdom that was lost during the century of humiliation after the Opium War. And that's a major point of contention for Chinese is that they really do want to regain their position that they held for most of their history, um, at least in a pre-globalized era, um, of local dominance, of having nobody to really contest them in any sense. Because China, for the vast majority of its history, was the uncontested dominant power in its area. Whether it was under Mongols or Manchus or native Han Chinese, it was still China, the state, was still the dominant power everywhere that it knew about. All of Asia pretty much bowed to it in some way or another. And so they want to return to that because that's their traditional mode of thought. But they find it's very difficult to do so in a modern globalized world where you've got powers that exist like the United States or even like Russia. The Chinese relationship with Russia is funny in itself, right? Because Russia was one of the only powers that the Chinese ever sort of acknowledged as an equal. And they managed to do a lot of this by keeping their interactions with them to a minimum. Like China and Russia are the two neighbors that sort of don't want to acknowledge that they're there, but they both very clearly are. It's like if you stick two elephants in a house and have them face away from each other, um, because facing towards each other would either cause conflict or cause an existential crisis for either society. Um, and I think that the only way that's going to change is if things come to a head with Russia's demographics, right? Its population is still very bad in terms of, its demographic situation. And, if China ever shifts its focus from the United States to Russia, they're going to be in a very bad position. Because Russia has lots of resource rich Siberia that they don't have enough people to defend or maintain in the long run. And, you know, it's just so funny how, we in the US move to antagonize people like Russia, who China in the long term is an existential threat to. But we effectively push them together by being just as big of an existential threat to either one of them. It's so funny.
Well, I see that ideological possession play out. I mean, it plays out on two different dynamics of. Obviously, you said it. But I like that the euphemism with the two big elephants in a room in a house that don't face each other. I mean, it's always been the case. You have the Russian bear, and then you have the sleeping bear in China. I mean, you don't want to wake either one of those up, but one of them's going to punch first. But it's always interesting because of how well. I mean, Russia has a deep cultural and historical stability to it as well, but not as stable and strong as the Chinese. I mean, you're right. They have that. Well, I mean, you could call it in a sense, and I know, a fascistic mentality of to maintain a natural order, but it's so much deeper and so much more well thought out in their culture than just that. And it's across the board, and how they wanted to. Well, I mean, they were basically like the British Empire for a long time because everybody had to kowtow down to China because of how powerful they were in Asia for so long. Just as on how the British slash Anglo English were in Europe, right? And throughout the world. I mean, the British empires had a ton of influence, and it's a long reigning empire. So just as much as China has carried that throughout, like you said, socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is also pretty hilarious because it is just straight up communism. But that stability and that cultural influence that's so undeniably there, it's so strong and prominent that it makes even Russia probably bat an eye and be like, you know what, mm, we know that, they're over there, but it might not be a good idea to poke at them because they got a lot more people than we do, and if we do make them mad, we're gonna have a lot to deal with. Like we're gonna have more to deal with than what you know. We're gonna bite off more than we can chew with this one. So that does put them at a very existentially strong position. Because I mean they just have straight up more people than anybody in the world, but that also you know demographically, well, they're pretty. I mean, as all Asian countries go, they're pretty strong on that front. Like they're very unified when it comes to that, right? They have a very unified culture, tradition. No matter on how communism has kind of kicked that stuff to the curb, well, it doesn't really matter because of how you have the Orthodox veneer over Russian tyranny throughout its history, right? Um, Whereas that has always kind of plunged a culture and a nation like Russia into chaos, whereas you think it would do that to a nation like China, and it just hasn't. Their resolve and their resiliency is just amazing. Just on how they just take it on the chin and move on and just don't care, which is to me a pretty dangerous mentality to have, especially if they're your neighbor or they're that big elephant in the room that doesn't want to look back at that other big elephant in the room.
Yeah, like I wouldn't even compare the Chinese to the British in that sense, um, because Britain was an overlord throughout much of the world, but in Europe it was just another country. You know, up until the 18th century, England was viewed as sort of a backwater when compared to countries like France or Germany. Um, it was on the periphery of Europe, and it used that position and its geography to exert influence on the rest of the world to make up for what it lacked in Europe. And eventually, it became so powerful through that it became a titan even among European countries. But this was all very short lived, in fact. Like, Britain did not become a truly dominant power until the mid to late 18th century, in truth. Like, until after the Seven Years' War, that was the one moment where Britain truly was the strongest country in Europe during the 18th century, between then and the American Revolution. And things balanced out. They were just another one of the great powers. And they didn't really hit their apex until after the Napoleonic Wars, um, when they became sort of the big elephant in the room for a lot of different countries, especially once again Russia. Um, but yeah, all that is dwarfed in longevity by just the relations between Russia and China. Those two have shared a border since the 17th century. And, it's only changed since the 19th century, since roughly 1860, when Russia took advantage of the weakness of the Qing and claimed much of the far eastern parts of Manchuria. And that's how you get Vladivostok and other parts of the Russian Far East. But aside from that, the borders really have hardly changed at all. Um, and all of Russia's interactions with China were more or less under the Qing, at least before that border change. And then later they had their Sino Soviet split, which came largely from China's, irrevocable desire to be a dominant power in its own right. Its refusal to just be part of the Soviet bloc. Um, and the Soviet Union not being able to stand any kind of independence among people in its sphere. So we in the U.S. took advantage of that split, propped up and supported communist China against the Soviet Union economically. Um, which, along with Deng's reforms, helped lead to China's increasing prosperity um, towards the end of the 20th century. But yeah, it's funny how the tables have flipped there. Now the Soviet Union is gone. Russia is nowhere near as big of a threat internationally as China. Um, Russia, its expansionist aims are limited to Europe for the most part, and very limited parts of Europe. Um, Whereas China, it's funny because they've never been an expansionist country, but at the same time, they have the capacity to do a lot more over a lot greater area than Russia does. The only area that the Russians are really a threat in whatsoever is in the nuclear area where they have the world's largest arsenal. But even that is so far down in terms of priority of what would be used that in day-to-day diplomatic and political disputes, it's almost irrelevant, right? Like MAD means that no matter how many nukes you have, if you have nukes, then basically, you're a power, which China does too, so that makes them just as big of a player as Russia and the US with regards to that. Um, but what makes China so strong is its massive population. Although, one thing to note is that their demographics for that population are really not very good. Because of the one child policy and a lot of the social and cultural changes in China, they have a demographic issue where their proportion of old people is going to get much too high. It's going to end up being like Japan pretty soon, where you have a whole society trying to support this older generation that it just can't. Now, I think the difference here is that the Chinese are much more willing to sacrifice those people than Japan ever was. Um, and so, who knows? They might get around it that way. But either way, India is set to surpass China as having the world's highest population very soon. China's got 1.40 billion. India has 1.38 billion people, meaning it's very close and it's gaining on China. So very soon, India will actually have the world's largest population for the first time in many centuries. Um, so that'll lead to a definite shift, at least symbolically, if nothing else, for a short period of time. But the effects will become material very soon as well. Um, of course, India has so many issues of its own that it's not nowhere near on the tier of China. But the two have many disputes. They've engaged in armed conflicts very recently. They have armed border disputes over territories in the Himalayan mountains, to where the two countries really do not get along at all. So, an unlikely, or well, I say unlikely, a likely area that is kind of a dark horse that people don't think about for places that a world conflict could break out. Really, it's in the Himalayas between China and India, because you've got these two growing powers, one of which is actually growing much faster than the other one at this point. And is it's about to have an even bigger population. It's really wanting to prove itself, because Indian nationalism is another whole topic in and of itself, as a very recent idea. Um, but since this is about China, I'll stick to China. But yeah, so China has enemies or potential enemies on multiple fronts. It's got a lot of places it can choose to expand if it wants to. Um, and even its economic sphere in Africa is significant. Um, but once again, they really just seem to be concerned with extracting resources from places like that and bringing them back to China. They really don't care much about the political influence. It's mostly just they want to have their current territory and whatever other little territories they claim, basically everything that the Qing Empire once had. And they want that, and then they want that territory to be the most powerful on Earth. You know, to have no other power that can possibly interfere with their own internal functioning. And then after that, I think really they'll kind of just settle down and just do what they do, you know? Um, Chinese history is a great pointer to this. Like, either they'll go on in prosperity under heaven forever, which is the goal of any Chinese dynasty, or they'll eventually collapse for internal reasons.
I mean, it's kind of awesome if you think about it, because they just purely, once again, do things for the sake of doing it. Like they don't have or put a whole lot of extracurricular um ideology or abstractions to it. It's just kind of, it is what it is, and we we can move on and add stability. Now, that's the other part, like with this, because you obviously have, like you stated, it's very different, obviously, with the Abrahamic ethics of what comes out of the three major Abrahamic religions. But I mean, there's obviously ethics attached to that, and that mentality. I mean, the Asian mentality across the board is just so different, and even foreign to probably even a place like Russia. I mean, they just don't understand that mentality because they don't see it the same way that they do, and that's probably, well, part of the reason why they probably are able to keep that mentality going and to keep that power, that centralized power in their country, because they're distinctly who they are. And if if you don't like it, well, then you you can look the other way. So that to me shows, well, a lot of stability. It also shows that throughout all of these changes and throughout all of this, they have stayed distinctly with the quote unquote revolutions that have happened. They have just stayed distinctly Chinese, which is a crazy thing to say because of how different the West does see itself. Because, I mean, obviously there's European culture, but there's also American culture, which is heavily influenced by European culture, right? With that, you can't say you have to say, Asian culture is heavily influenced by Chinese culture. Like, it's not the other way around. And to me, that shows, a lot of stability and a lot of strength, and obviously a very long lasting civilization that has been around and has, well, institutional wisdom to it. No, despite what it may have had as those characteristics that have changed, it shows that in a long strive for a need to have stability, well, you had the culture that was stable to begin with unstable changes, and we'll say, characters at play, but, through, well, divine providence, I guess, is how they would classify it, or, a gift from heaven. They would keep it that way as such. Whereas, obviously, on the flip side, with Christianity, that's more so of God's will, God's providence, right? So, in a way, they do have a lot of naturalistic and naturally ordered ideas. It just doesn't come out as expressed in, well, I'm obviously going to stick to Christianity because of, I that's what I know, and it comes out in that dynamic. It's not as personified. Like, I always found it interesting on how, they pick animals um as well, not only kung fu moves and stances and all that, but they've also picked like a mythological beast like the dragon, right? And the dragon represents good things in Chinese, primarily Chinese culture, you know, and it brings about, the good things in life. Whereas in European culture, oh, it's the opposite. of what the Asians, in particular the Chinese, believe it to be so, right? So with that dynamic going on, it's you have all these different cultural dynamics at play, but to me it just shows how different expressions suit the needs of that culture, and they obviously stability is there and is a cornerstone and a hallmark, and we keep beating that drum on it, but it's true, and how they've sustained all this throughout time, and just how amazing that has just been. I mean, just that sheer will, it's just incredible.
Yeah, just the dragon is a kind of interesting microcosm of the difference in mentality between Chinese and Europeans, because to the Chinese, the dragon is a force of nature, right? It is divine in the sense that it is a manifestation of the wisdom and power of the natural order. Whereas to Europeans, it's just another monster to be slain, right? Because there's kind of this tautology in Europe that if something lives, it can die, and if something dies, it can be killed. You know, and the dragon, and this is kind of very Faustian actually. It's very will to power ish. The dragon is just another obstacle to be conquered. It's just another thing that the hero, that the overman has to enforce his will over. If you want to look at it from a pagan perspective, or if you want to look at it from a Christian perspective, it then becomes a representation, like every other thing that gets in people's way, of just Satan, right? It becomes just a creature of evil. Um, that in sort of the Germanic crusader mentality, that the hero then has to go slay in the name of God. It's the same mentality, but with different religious tones depending on what period of history you're looking at it from. Whereas for the Chinese, there was no big religious revolution, so it's all been kind of just the same. Um, but they're not nearly as concerned with the idea of conquest, the idea of achievement, as people in the West are, right? Like they're much more concerned with the idea of maintaining order, um, of prestige, right? They do things for the sake of recognition rather than for the sake of just doing them. It seems like you bring honor to your family, um, or you bring honor to society, your ancestors, whoever. That is a much more important concept than I did this, I conquered this, I achieved this. You know, and so I think it's just a fundamental difference in mentality that affects all levels of society.
Oh yeah, I mean that collectivization mentality across the board is so inherently anti-Western thinking that it's just I mean it strikes our very senses, especially the ones that are more sensible and less ideologically possessed than others. He's looking at you, conservatives and liberals, but it's more so, less of that individualistic mentality where, oh, I just slayed this dragon, and you hit the nail on the head when it came to the microcosm because of the manifestation of that natural order that expresses itself. Yeah, I mean that's just when somebody says metaphorically, "Oh, I slayed the dragon," in the West we're thinking you overcame an obstacle, you moved forward, you moved past something. Um, that that could have been any number of things, right? Whereas that maintaining of a natural order and not having that uh, conquest kind of spirit doesn't really resonate with us as Europeans, and it's just it's strange. But then in a lot of ways, as as much as the Japanese fought against the Chinese to conquer them, they still couldn't do it. Which the weird part is that on how resilient they are. I mean, they're in a lot of ways the Germans of Asian people, um, but they just straight up just tried to conquer China, and they couldn't. They couldn't because of how well massive the population is and how massive the land mass is as compared to Japan. But they had that conquest kind of spirit and just still could not do it. I mean, it blows my mind and how continuously resilient they really are.
Well, talking about Japan, that's not the only time that they've tried to conquer China. Um, you know, and it's astonishing how well they did during World War II, actually. When you consider the sheer David and Goliath, population disparity involved there, the amount of people the Japanese were fighting against at the same time. Um, arguably, if they had not been fighting the Western powers at the same time, many think that the Japanese damn well could have conquered China, during World War II. And they just didn't because they got so bogged down dealing with the rest of the world. But, there was another invasion that happened where the shogun, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, had unified Japan, and he was invading Korea as a stepping stone to invading and conquering Ming China, which sounds absolutely bonkers to us that, thinking that shogunate Japan could take on China during its last native Han dynasty that was an extremely powerful country. Um, and this was in the 1590s, keep in mind. So this was before the Ming were really entering their final stages of instability and collapse. Where the technological disparity between them and Japan was not very great at all. Japan had a lot of newly imported European firearms, but even these were not much more advanced than what the Chinese had. Um, so, yeah. And then, Hideyoshi died, and that caused the invasion of Korea to fail. But that's another interesting alternate history to think of is what if an early Japanese empire appeared during the 17th century? Um, but yeah. And what that conquest mentality made me think of though was actually the Mongols, because the way I see it, it's kind of a step mentality in origin, right? It kind of goes back to the Indo Europeans when they were the original horseback nomadic conquerors ages ago. And the Mongols just kind of had the same mentality because they lived a similar lifestyle. But even then, their idea of the sky god of Tengri, um, as being sort of this manifestation of the Almighty above, you know, of the natural world, it is different than a monotheistic Western perspective. But at the same time, during the Mongol Empire, many of them converted to Islam and some to Christianity. Um, and they seem to have kind of carried that mentality over with them in that. So it's just a whole rabbit hole in and of itself. Um, but as far as the actual, like, anything related to China or just the Chinese revolutions in particular, which was the original topic of this, which we've kind of tangented far off of. Granted, a lot of it's just because stuff requires context, but still, like, I really think there's not an incredible amount more to cover with the details we know. I could have done a lot more research into the exact details of how these things happen. I used to have a very good book on the communist revolution in particular that went into very deep detail about a lot of this in a book on Chinese history in general. But, I feel like going deep into some of these details really doesn't help much in terms of just general understanding of what happened. I feel like most of the background to this was covered, talking about the century of humiliation, how the Europeans basically destroyed China's traditional image of itself in relation to the world, and how that, along with the importation of Enlightenment ideas, caused multiple revolutions. Um, and how, because of various events, that ended up leading up to the communist China that we now have as a major world player today. So, um, yeah, if you've got anything else on that, then do elaborate, because I think that's about all I've got.
No, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of ground and a lot of background because obviously getting bogged down with details is a little. Oh, we could get as tangential as possible, but we would be on for another couple of hours if we went down to brass tacks. But yeah, I mean that's all I got. I mean, it's just I've learned a lot, and it's a very broad, and as y'all out there couldn't tell, it's got quite a few rabbit holes. So the digging, is something to always be tangential about. But other than that, that's it for me.
Yeah. Um, this has been a little bit shorter than our usual episodes, but nothing wrong with that. Minute 45. That's nothing. Nothing to scoff at, I think. So, yeah. I don't know if there's really anything else to say. I think we can kind of just wrap it up here.
See y'all later. God bless.
Y'all take care.